He dismissed the timid, awkward assistant in front of the entire boardroom, only to realize days later that she was the only daughter of the billionaire positioned to rescue his collapsing empire. Now his future depends on her. And she hasn't come seeking revenge, but something far more profound. Sometimes the people we underestimate become the very ones we must look up to in the end. The Monday morning sky was so clear it felt almost unnatural. Inside the towering glass boardroom of Grayson Enterprises, the air carried both power and pressure, thick enough that only those accustomed to winning could breathe it easily. At the head of the long table sat Alexander Grayson. Around him, his executives sat stiff and silent, dabbing sweat from their foreheads despite the icy air conditioning. Everyone knew what today meant: a meeting with a critical investor whose decision could determine whether the company survived or collapsed. Standing by the projector controls was Isabella. She wasn't an executive, just the CEO's secretary, a role that always seemed the most disposable when times got rough. She knew her position could vanish in an instant. The presentation began smoothly. Slide after slide was polished perfection, until they reached the single most important section. The financial strategy file. The screen blinked, then went black. An error flashed, unsupported format. For a few seconds, the room froze. No one spoke. Only the faint creak of a chair and the sound of someone's pen tapping broke the silence. The investor's representative raised an eyebrow and shifted his gaze to Alexander, who slowly turned toward Isabella. "Which file did you send?" he asked coolly. Isabella's stomach dropped. She rushed to her laptop, heart pounding, hands cold. She was certain she had sent the right version, even backed it up. But when she opened her screen, the file staring back was an incomplete draft. I uploaded the final copy last night. Maybe there was a sync issue." Alexander let out a short, cutting laugh. "A sync error? Do you think this is some kind of school project?" She tried to explain, but he was already walking toward her, each step heavy with accusation. His voice didn't rise, but every word landed like a blade. Unbelievable. Millions spent to keep. This company running, and it all unravels because a secretary can't manage a simple task. This, he swept his hand toward her, is what happens when you hire for quotas. A girl with no credentials, no authority, no real experience. Just a check mark for diversity. A chair scraped back as one of the investors quietly left the room. Alexander ignored it. "I used to believe anyone could learn given the right tools. But some people are born to watch from the sidelines." The room stayed painfully silent. Isabella looked straight into his eyes, unflinching. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She held his gaze with a quiet strength that was easy to mistake for weakness until you realized it was something else entirely. A promise. A warning. "You're fired," Alexander said at last. His voice was cold, final, precise, like a knife sliding across glass. Isabella bowed her head slightly, as though gathering her pride into something sharp and controlled. She closed her laptop, walked to the door, and left without a word. Only, after the doors shut, did a junior employee whisper, "She didn't deserve that," but no one else spoke. No one dared to. In the elevator, Isabella's reflection met her own. Her hands shook, her eyes stayed clear. She didn't know how the file had been switched, and it no longer mattered. What she carried with her were his words, his tone, his contempt. She whispered under her breath, "I'll return," but not as anyone's secretary. 3 days later, the atmosphere in the office had turned to ice. No one mentioned the incident, yet everyone remembered. Alexander couldn't shake it either. Normally, he never looked back at small mistakes. But something about Isabella lingered. The silence, the stare, the way she walked away. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't weakness. It was something far more dangerous. certainty. By Thursday morning, the IT report arrived. The presentation failure had been caused by a server malfunction, not human error, not Isabella's mistake. Alexander. Read the words, felt each one burn into him, then deleted the email without a reply. Breathing in his own office suddenly felt unbearable. That afternoon, the company prepared for its most important private meeting of the year. William Miller, a reclusive but legendary figure in global finance, a man powerful enough to alter the future of entire industries. Alexander greeted him with his usual steel composure, though unease gnawed at him. Miller walked in, tall, silver-haired, sharp-eyed. He shook Alexander's hand and took his seat. But he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a young woman. No flashy jewelry, no loud colors, just quiet elegance. Yet her presence drew every eye in the room. She carried herself not as a guest, but as if she had always belonged here. Isabella. Alexander froze. His breath caught as reality snapped into focus. She looked directly at him, her gaze steady, unreadable, not angry, not vengeful, but with the calm strength of someone who had already won without lifting a finger. William Miller rested his hands on the table and spoke evenly. "This is my partner in this investment. My daughter, Isabella Miller." The room rippled with whispers. A director dropped his pen, but Alexander heard none of it. The world around him blurred, slowing like a broken reel of film. He could only see her, Isabella, standing there, not as his secretary, not as his subordinate, but as the woman who now held his company's fate in her hands, and her eyes told him what no words needed to. She hadn't come back for revenge. She had come back for something greater. Full of power. She stood there steady and asked quietly, but with enough force to collapse whatever pride remained. "You never asked for my full name, did you?" The room went still, and Alexander couldn't say a word. Never. He had never asked. To him, she had always been just Isabella, a name as common as the dozens of secretaries who had passed through these halls. He had never once imagined that the woman in modest suits, eyes often lowered, frame shrinking into corners, could walk into this boardroom, stand beside William Miller, and look at him like a stranger, stripped of all power. The meeting went on. William presented his vision for collaboration with composed clarity, but Alexander heard only half of it. The other half he spent confronting his reflection, one that had just been held up to him, ruthless, hasty, and shallow. When the meeting ended, Isabella was the last to leave. She said nothing more. But as she passed Alexander's seat, she paused just long enough for him to understand the message behind her silence. "We're not in the same place anymore, and you no longer get to call me secretary." The door closed behind her for the second time. But this time, Alexander knew. The door that had just shut wasn't the boardroom. It was the door to a chance he'd lost. And the part that hurt the most was the silence she left behind. Alexander didn't sleep that night. He'd sat through hundreds of meetings, survived financial rejections, media smear campaigns, even lost billions in a failed deal, but never had he felt so small, not because of a hit to his reputation, but because he had just been outplayed by a woman he once deemed invisible, who quietly placed an ace on the table and walked away without looking back. It wasn't an attack. It was a move in a brilliantly played game, and he'd lost in the first turn. Around midnight, Alexander drafted an email. No empty subject line like apologies, no polished excuses, just one line unusually direct for a man like him. "I was wrong. You deserved respect from the very beginning." He read it 3 times before hitting send. He wasn't sure why he called. Her "you" in such an intimate tone, something rarely used in business apologies. Perhaps because deep down he knew Between them, it had never been just business. By morning, her reply came. Isabella wrote only one sentence. Next time, verify the truth before you destroy someone. No, thank you. No sign of forgiveness. Just a line sharp enough to remind him. She hadn't broken, and she would never let herself be underestimated again. Alexander read it over and over. For a moment, he wanted to reply to explain that he hadn't. Meant to, that he was protecting the company's image, that he too had been a victim of technical error. But he stopped himself because he knew none of that mattered next to the fact that she had been humiliated in front of dozens. That afternoon, William invited him to his private office, not to withdraw the investment, nor to scold him. He simply poured a drink, offered Alexander a glass, and sat down on a leather chair, legs crossed, calm, composed, impossible to read. "I don't interfere in personal matters between colleagues," he began, his voice low and firm. "But the capital in this deal, it's Isabella's. I'm just here to assist with technical due diligence." Alexander said nothing. The statement wasn't a warning, but it landed like a heavy steel gate closing behind him, reminding him once again he was the one at the table asking. "Not the one choosing," William continued, voice still neutral. "She's not the kind to hold grudges long, but she doesn't forget easily either. That girl's memory is sharp as a blade." Alexander nodded. "I know. If you want to stay at this table," William said, refilling his glass with a pointed look, "start by learning not to underestimate people." Alexander didn't answer. Inside, every excuse had begun to sound meaningless. All he could do now was wait for a chance if any remained. In the days that followed, Alexander saw Isabella a few times during finance meetings, strategy board discussions. She was always punctual, impeccably dressed, concise in her responses, not cold, but never warm. To everyone else, she was the heirs of a powerful investor. But to him, she was a question that still had no answer. One afternoon, he saw her alone on the rooftop balcony. Unlike her composed presence in meeting rooms, now she had loosened her silk tie, one hand resting. On the glass railing, eyes fixed on the foggy horizon. He wanted to walk over, but he stopped. Not because he lacked courage, but because for the first time in his life, Alexander Grayson understood not every mistake can be erased with an apology. And sometimes, the only thing you can do is learn how to stay silent at the right moment. 1 week after the meeting with William Miller, the name Alexander Grayson no longer belonged solely to power. Grayson now carried another meaning: scandal. It began with an anonymous blog post on a popular finance industry site. Fewer than 800 words, but packed with enough detail to ignite a media storm. CEO of Grayson Holdings accused of leveraging personal ties with a secretary to manipulate a powerful female investor. Internal event photos leaked unverified messages, and unnamed company insiders paint a picture hard to deny. His power and intimacy being used as bargaining chips in high-stakes finance. Within hours, the post was everywhere. Social media exploded. The name Isabella Miller surfaced in online debates. But strangely, she remained silent. No confirmation, no denial, no appearance. It was that very silence that fueled the wildfire. Some claimed she was the victim. Others believed she was the quiet manipulator, and the only name stamped on every headline was Alexander's. For the first time in his career, he had no idea how to respond. Reporters called non-stop. One journalist stood outside Grayson Holdings every morning live streaming with the hashtag GraysonGate. A crisis board meeting was called that same week. Under the sterile lights of the executive room, Alexander entered like a man who knew he was about to pay the price. The first to speak wasn't an adversary, but a previously neutral board member. "We're not here to debate the truth of the article," he said, "but you need to understand this is no longer personal. This is about company reputation, stock value, investor trust, and what we stand to lose without a clear explanation." Alexander stayed silent. Part of him wanted to speak, to shout that he'd been wronged, that this was a calculated attack, but the other part knew too well. Once the media outpaces the truth, the first voice rarely gets believed. Isabella remained absent, his messages unanswered, emails ignored. Even his calls were met with a cold, mechanical voice. The user is unavailable to take your call. Where was she? He wanted to know, not to plead his case, but simply to ask one question. Why are you silent? The office felt unusually hollow. The eyes that once followed him down the halls were now quiet, weary. No one had to say it. He could feel it. They were waiting to see him fall. The press dug up old connections, former female, colleagues who had left abruptly, ambiguous relationships with female partners in past deals. Hey, portrait emerged. A ruthless, ambitious CEO who would use anything to win, including other people's emotions. Alexander knew he was losing everything, not because he'd done something wrong. He still believed he hadn't, but because he had once dismissed the truth, disregarded the feelings of others, and now it was all coming back to him in the most distorted form imaginable. One evening he stood alone in his dark office. Everyone else had gone. The city outside gleamed, pulsing with energy, but inside him was a stillness that felt unfamiliar. He remembered the moment Isabella first walked out of that boardroom, her eyes, her silence. If he had just listened, then opened his heart just a little. Maybe he wouldn't be standing now on the edge of loss and regret. He once believed he didn't need anyone to succeed, but now he was starting to understand. Success could never save him from himself. And Isabella, by saying nothing at all, was making that painfully clear. The news spread like a virus in a winter surge. Alexander was no longer judged solely as an executive, but as a man, a CEO, a once everything whose everything was now slipping away piece by piece. Isabella knew. She read the articles like anyone else, without urgency, without alarm. But each mention of her name, every cropped photo, every cruel comment, pulled her back to that moment, standing in a boardroom, stripped bare by words that judged her for where she came from, how she looked for being just a secretary. She had chosen silence. She intended to let him sink in what he had built, his pride, his control, his cold, almost indifferent distance. But then, late one night, she stepped into her father's study. William Miller sat reading reports, half-frame glasses perched. Low on his nose, warm lamplight softening the creases at the corners of his eyes. "Can't sleep?" he asked, eyes still on the page. "Not for me." William looked up, waiting. Isabella didn't speak right away. She stood there quiet, as if weighing every word, every feeling. Then she placed a small USB on the desk, a recording of an internal meeting at Zeta Capital. I got it from an old friend in cybersecurity. William didn't blink, but he set his glasses down slowly, acknowledging the gravity of what she'd brought. This proves everything the media's been saying about Alexander was planted. A smear campaign. And the target isn't just him. It's us. He stared at her for a long moment, then asked softly, "Why are you bringing this to me?" She took a deep breath. "Because I won't let the company you invested in be destroyed by a lie." Her voice didn't tremble. But in her eyes, the storm had settled, not into anger, but into resolve. "I know you don't need me to fix this, and Grayson can survive its own crisis. But if we stay silent, we're letting the truth be rewritten." William nodded slowly. "And what do you plan to do?" "Let me handle it." The next day, Alexander sat in his office, buried in emails from legal teams, PR firms, crisis consultants. Everyone told him the same thing. Say nothing. Wait for the storm to pass. The door swung open. No knock. Isabella walked in, holding a folder and the USB in her coat pocket. She wasn't dressed in her usual office attire, a long gray trench coat, hair pulled back, eyes steady. She brought with her a chill that cut through the room like frost. Alexander shot to his feet. He didn't know what to say. In the past 10 days he'd rehearsed 100 ways to begin, but none seemed worthy now. Isabella didn't need him to speak. She placed the USB on the desk and looked him square in the eye. This contains a recording of a meeting between two Zeta Capital partners. They discuss fabricating stories to tank your reputation and drive down Grayson's stock. He stared at her stunned, partly from the content, mostly because he never imagined she'd come back. Never imagined she would be the one handing him a lifeline when the world had already walked away. "Why?" he began, but she cut him off. "Don't misunderstand. I'm not doing this for you." Her voice was calm but unyielding. "I'm doing this because I believe in justice, not for you." She turned, walking toward the door. As her hand touched the knob, Alexander said softly. Isabella, she stopped, didn't turn. "I thank you." Silence. 1 second, then 2, then 3. She spoke, still facing away. "Don't say my name like you ever knew who I was." And then the door closed behind her for the 3rd time, but this time not with the silence of resentment. This time with the weight of principle. After Isabella left the office, Alexander didn't call after her. He didn't dare. The small USB she left on his desk sat there, innocuous in appearance, but it carried the weight of a verdict. He didn't touch it right away, not out of doubt, but out of shame. Throughout his career, Alexander had taken down rivals, negotiated hundreds of deals, commanded rooms with a cold stare, but never had anyone treated him the way Isabella had, not with hatred, not with forgiveness. She simply walked away and left him to face himself. He didn't beg for a second chance, didn't ask to be forgiven. But that night, he did something rare. He stayed at the office until morning. He watched the lights go out across the upper floors. One by one, each bulb flickering off like someone who had once believed in him, and then quietly walked away. Dawn Alexander picked up the phone and called William Miller. "I want to hold a press conference," he said, voice but steady. "I'm not asking for your help, just that she be there." William made no promises. He paused, then replied, "If she shows up, it's because she chooses to. No one forces her." That afternoon, the headquarters auditorium was packed. National media filled the room. The live stream broadcasted across 4 platforms. Over 700 internal employees tuned in remotely. All eyes were on Alexander Grayson, the CEO nearly toppled by scandal, about to speak. No one knew what he would say. When he walked out, every camera turned toward him. No suit, no earpiece mic, just a man in a simple white shirt, his face hollowed but his eyes clearer than they'd ever been. "Good afternoon," Alexander began. No script, in hand. His voice was low, deliberate, each word carved from the weight of pain he had inflicted on himself. "I know many of you no longer trust me, and you're right. When someone uses power to create fear, trust is the first thing to vanish." He scanned the room. No smiles, no sympathetic glances. "I used to believe that being right meant never having to apologize, that outcomes justified everything, that I was the center of it all. But then someone said nothing at all. She just walked away. And that's when I started to feel afraid." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the far corner of the room. Isabella Miller. The name left his lips slowly with certainty and hesitation. "I wronged her, not just by questioning her ability, but something worse. I disregarded her dignity as a human being." A photographer raised a camera. Alexander didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped to the edge of the stage, gripping the microphone with both hands. "No words can undo what's been done. But today I want to bow my head not to this company, but to the man I used to be." And he did. He bowed. For a long time, silence filled the room. Not the kind that makes people uneasy, but the kind that holds weight, as if everyone was holding their breath. Not to break what had just been offered. Honesty. From the back row, someone stood Isabella wearing a black blazer, hair neatly tied back, her gaze calm, not angry, not cold, just unflinching. She stood there, said nothing, didn't need to. Alexander saw her and he didn't smile, just gave a quiet nod like a man receiving his sentence with gratitude. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said one last time. "I just hope I have the courage to live differently from today forward." He pulled the USB from his pocket, placed it on the podium, said nothing more, and walked off the stage. No music, no host, no roaring applause, just a door closing quietly behind him, and in front of him, a woman who chose to stand and witness when she never had to. What do you think of this apology? If you were Isabella, but would you have stayed? Follow to catch the next chapter? Because sometimes the true ending isn't in what we say, but in how we live afterward. 3 weeks after the press conference, Grayson Holdings announced one of the most significant strategic restructurings in its history. No one was surprised when William Miller was officially named the largest shareholder. But what sent shockwaves through the financial world was the detail that followed. The person granted authority over the strategic stake wasn't William. It was Isabella Miller. The news spread like lightning across a clear sky. Inside the sea, company had hit like a tidal wave, not because Isabella lacked competence. Anyone who had worked with her knew exactly how sharp she was, but because just months ago she'd been the secretary fired in public. Now she was back, not as an employee, but as the one with decision-making power on the strategic board. The announcement ceremony was simple, unembellished, but the air in the room was anything but light. There were skeptical glances, whispers. What will she do? Retaliate? Remove Alexander? Isabella walked onto the stage in a form-fitting black suit, hair tied high, lips painted a deep red, not for beauty, but to make a point. She was no longer someone who bowed her head. She didn't look toward Alexander, seated in the front, a row, his expression still void of excess. She stood before the microphone, scanning the room, eye contact unflinching. She knew exactly what she represented, not just capital, but a conviction. "When you're treated unfairly," she began, her voice low but resonant, "you have 2 choices, stay silent or stand up." A pause. "Today I choose to stand up, not for revenge, but for change." The room fell completely silent. Not out of fear, but out of conviction. "I'm not here to dismantle anyone. I'm here to show those who once thought they could assign value based on title and appearance that the world has moved on." Some lowered their heads, others glanced at Alexander. Isabella continued, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Forgiveness means refusing to let pain decide your choices." She looked toward Alexander. Her gaze was no longer cold, no longer distant, but not warm either. It was the gaze of someone who had moved through pain and chosen not to let it define her. "I'm not returning as someone wounded. I'm returning as someone who knows her worth and will never, again, let anyone diminish it." She stepped down from the stage as applause began to rise, slow, steady, from those who had once witnessed her humiliation and now saw her standing tall. Alexander didn't clap. He just watched. But this time he truly saw her. He didn't rise, didn't follow, didn't speak. He understood now. The strong don't need your justifications. They only need you to be silent long enough to realize how much they deserved better all along. Isabella walked past him. She didn't stop, but just as her shoulder brushed his, she tilted her head slightly. "This time you don't need to apologize. Just don't repeat it." And then she walked on without looking back. 1 week after Isabella's appointment, the offices of Grayson Holdings returned to their usual rhythm. The headlines faded. The market steadied, and the media moved on to the next scandal. But for some, something still lingered beneath the surface. Late Friday evening on the 25th floor, the private wing reserved for the shareholders' representative. Most of the lights had already gone out. Only a faint glow remained in the far corner office, where Isabella was closing up files preparing to leave. A soft knock sounded on the door. She looked up. The door eased open. It was Alexander, no longer the sharp-suited CEO, nor the man who had once stood before hundreds to apologize. Tonight he wore a simple dress shirt, holding a paper bag in his hand. "Peppermint tea and flaxseed cookies," he said, placing the bag on her desk. "I remember you once said this was your go-to combo after a terrible day." Isabella looked up at him, her eyes neither cold nor soft. She said nothing. Alexander stood there for a moment, then quietly added, "I'm not here to ask for anything. Just if you'd allow it, I'd like to start over from the beginning." The air seemed to pause, a long beat, long enough for someone to weigh not emotion, but consequence. Isabella tilted her head slightly, lips curving. Not a smile, but the kind of poised consideration that wears a polite smile like armor. "From the beginning," she echoed, voice light as a feather brushing marble. "Then which position are you applying for?" Alexander froze. Then he smiled. Not the smile of someone who'd won, but of someone who understood the new rules and was willing to start from scratch if allowed. Isabella didn't linger for his reply. She gathered the tray of tea and biscuits and headed toward the doorway. Just as she drew level with him, she hesitated. No touch, only a low murmur. "This time, don't listen to answer. Listen to truly hear." Her heels tapped softly against the floor as she left, each step fading like the last note of a song. Forgiveness may come, but what follows must be earned. Alexander stayed behind in the stillness of the office, the faint aroma of peppermint drifting through the air. For the first time, he didn't have certainty about the days ahead. Yet he understood something new. Not every ending is a defeat. Some are simply pauses, holding space for a beginning that fits better. And now I turn to you. Should Isabella allow Alexander another chance, or should she hold fast to the strength and freedom she's found? Share your thoughts below. If this story resonated with you, remember to like, share, and follow for more moments that explore the choices of the heart. The tale may close here, but its echo remains, waiting to be carried forward.